So as most of you know, the Zodiac killer terrorized California in the late 1960s, leaving behind a trail of cryptic letters and unsolved murders. But despite decades of investigation, the Zodiac's true identity remains a mystery. But as I told you in the beginning of this video, there is a twist. A man on TikTok, user @jfoy_3.0, claims his grandfather, Richard Hoffman, is the real Zodiac killer. He presents supposed evidence and family secrets that have absolutely blown up the internet. So this could be an insane breakthrough that everyone has been waiting for decades now, or it could be another conspiracy theory. So I think most people know who the Zodiac killer is, but I don't think a lot of people know the exact details of the crimes he committed and what he did to taunt police. So I think it's really important that we go over those details and the attacks that happened, and then we get into what this TikToker claims. So let's start at the first attack. So the first attack of many the Zodiac would commit would be on December 20th, 1968, against Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday. The couple was on their first date at a couple's woohoo spot. You know what I'm talking about. I just tried to wink and did I just blink? Did I wink? Let me try that again. A couple's woohoo spot on Lake Herman Road, a well-known lover's lane. I'm nailing it. And this was just outside the city of Vallejo, California. Betty Lou Jensen was 16 and David Faraday was 17 years old. Betty was a Colorado native and a very active student at Hogan High School as a junior, not to mention an honor student as well. She was also a Grand Royal Bride of Primavera Council, number 132, which was part of the Pythian Sunshine Girls, which apparently their purpose is to lay down a foundation of purity, service, and usefulness in all things that help to make the lives of those around us happier and the world a better place to live in. The motto even being, do all the good you can in all the ways you can to all the people you can. So she was a literal angel. She was a literal, actual angel, which just makes this all the more worse. And David Faraday was a native to San Rafael, and he was a senior at Vallejo High School. He was also on the wrestling team and an active member of the school's government, and also an Eagle Scout member. He was also a holder of the God and Country Award, a high honor in scouting, and he was also very active in his church. So again, another literal angel. Like these kids were so good. However, all that would change on December 28th, 1968, around 11 p.m. Despite being the angels that they are also teenagers, and they did lie to their parents about going out to where they were. And this was something they would not usually do at all. So it was a very freak event for them, and it would not bode in their favor. So they would go to this Lover's Lane location, and suddenly an unknown assailant would come up to their car and start firing on them with a gun before they even knew what was going on. But the unknown shooter would miss the couple with his first few shots, and they would both scramble towards the passenger door to escape the other gunshots. Betty Lou Jensen was able to escape at that moment, while David Faraday was unfortunately shot in the head with a .22 rifle. And although Betty Lou did escape at the time, she would run away and she would be shot at 6 more times by the shooter, and 5 of those would land in her back. And this is when the assailant would get back into his vehicle and drive off. And about 10 minutes later at 11:10 p.m., a passing motorist would notice the 2 bodies on the ground and in the vehicle, and would immediately flag the police down to investigate the scene. And while on the scene, Betty Lou was pronounced dead, but David Faraday was still breathing. However, he would succumb to his wounds later on in the hospital. No motive was obviously found for this murder, other than the killer being some sort of madman. No shit. And an investigation would last for 7 months afterwards and would have extensive coverage by the media. But the trail would inevitably run dry, and the rest of the investigation kind of seemed futile until the killer would strike again. 7 months later, this time would be much, much differed. Darlene Ferrin, who was 22, and Michael McGow, who was 19, would be the Zodiac killer's next victims. Darlene was very popular in her community due to her job at a very popular local restaurant, and that's where she would inevitably meet Michael McGow. She would continue to see him despite already being married to Dean Ferrin. Ooh, not good. Until they had a date on July 4th, 1969. After 11:30, Darlene would receive a call at her house from a presumed Michael McGow, where she promptly left and went to Miguel's house at around 11:50 p.m. And these facts kind of become blurred due to conflicting stories, but the story goes as such. Sorry, I gotta put my glasses on. I can't see shit on this computer. Oh my god, these are dirty. 1 second. Much better. Okay. So Darlene and Michael would then drive to Blue Rock Springs Park, where they would promptly park in the parking lot. This spot was popular again with couples in the area, a lover's lane of sorts, as was the other one. A car would then pull up where occupants were laughing and setting off fireworks to celebrate Independence Day before driving off. However, another car would pull up nearby the couple, where they would park and sit there motionless for a while. Creepy. And after a few minutes, the car would pull away, but it would only come back just a few minutes later. I would have been gone. I would have been gone at this point. Just saying. Then the driver would open the car door and step out of the car, walking up to the couple's car, and would be shining a flashlight in their window. Naturally, Darlene would think it was a police officer, so she would roll down her car window to speak to the police officer. However, it wasn't, and the driver would pull out his gun and start open firing inside the vehicle. One of the bullets would hit Darlene in the neck, causing her to slump over onto the steering wheel, and Michael would be shot in the arm. And Michael would try to escape the vehicle, but the door handle was either missing or it was removed. The driver would then walk away from the car while Michael was screaming in pain and struggling with the door. This would cause the assailant to walk back to the vehicle and head towards the couple again. 4 more shots would be fired, 2 for each victim. The attacker would then hop back into his car and drive away. Shortly after, 3 teenagers would happen upon the couple's car and the couple's bodies, and they would notify police. Police would arrive on the scene at 12:20 a.m., where the couple was taken to the hospital immediately, and Darlene was unfortunately declared deceased. However, Michael McGow would survive, and he would give a description to police. Michael would describe the killer as a white man with a large face, heavy set, standing at around 5'8" and weighing 195 to 200 pounds. He had short, curly, light brown hair with a pot belly. Sounds like a stud. And he was wearing dark clothes and did not have glasses. But even with these details, it was not enough to find a suspect. But at around 12:40 a.m., something very strange happened. The Vallejo Police Department would receive a phone call from a nearby public telephone that was only 2 blocks away from them, where a man on the line said this:
"I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye."
Yeah, nightmare fuel, if you ask me. So this guy's just toying with the police, making sure that they know it's him. He's clearly just this like psychopathic, narcissistic, evil piece of shit. And he would not stop there. So they knew the same man who committed this murder was the exact same man who committed the 2 murders 7 months prior. He was making a name for himself now, and police had many more questions. And this is where the first of the letters would come into play as well. So a month later, on August 1st, 1969, the letters prepared by the killer were given to the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. And scarily enough, all the letters received were completely identical, stating that he was the one who killed the people at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. And he would explain that the people that he murdered would become his slaves in the afterlife. What the f***? And the letter only included 1/3 of a 408 symbol cryptogram, that which the Zodiac killer claimed was the answer to his identity. And the other future letters had the other 2/3. And on top of the terrifying letters he had sent in, he said to the paper editors that if they did not put the cryptogram in the papers on the front page, he would cruise around all weekend, killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend. That's gaslighting at its finest, but it was a terrifying threat, which everyone obviously took insanely seriously and would post their respective portion that the Zodiac killer wished. Which brings us to attack number 3. So the second confirmed Zodiac killer attack, which we just talked about, came 7 months after the first one that we talked about. But the length of time between number 2 and number 3 would be drastically shorter, which we've seen with serial killers is a very, very common theme. They get used to what they do and they start to perfect it, and they start to do it more and more often, especially if you're like a psychopathic narcissist. You can think you can keep getting away with it, and less time between kills becomes more and more of a craving. So only 2 months after the murders of Darlene and Michael, the Zodiac killer would strike again on September 22nd, 1969. Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell were friends, though the two had dated in the past couple of years. Cecilia had eventually moved to another school, so they would break up, but had come back to visit friends, and during a dinner at the cafeteria, Brian had asked her if she was doing anything special that afternoon. She asked why, and he suggested that they go for a walk to San Francisco, to be specific, and just find something to do. And that evening, after running around to purchase some items and to drop off some of the folks that they were currently with, it was already getting late at that point. And rather than rushing to make a trip out to San Francisco, Brian would remember a place that he frequented on Lake Berryessa. So they would try to find the spot at Lake Berryessa, but they would have trouble finding it because it was so dark, so they would just land on a spot where there were no cars around and just say this is where they were going to hang out. Brian would leave his car at 56 Carmen Gia by the side of the road, and they would trek about a quarter mile to the edge of the lake. And it was this beautiful little peninsula that would turn into complete water in the wetter seasons. But since it was still summer, it was just a little island that anybody could really go to. So they would lay down, and Cecilia would rest her head on his shoulder while they both spoke, reminiscing about old times and good times, until they heard a rustling nearby. And Cecilia would look up and over Brian's shoulder, and she would see a man and tell Brian that she sees a man. But Brian, facing the opposite way, thought she was talking about seeing a man at a neighboring picnic area, because there were other areas that they could see that other people could picnic at, so he didn't really think anything of it. But the figure was much closer than Brian had believed, and when Cecilia said, no, there's a man over there, the man would take a step behind a tree, so Brian saw him taking a step behind the tree and would just assume that he was taking a leak, which is fair. But that's when Cecilia would say, oh my God, he has a gun. And the danger would soon become realized for Brian. And Brian, who was entering the field of sociology in his studies, would talk to this man, saying he's read about the criminal mind. And he would offer to help him, actually, with no strings attached, basically, trying to get out of the situation. And Brian wouldn't have any money on him. He would only have 50 cents, in fact. But he said maybe he can help in another way. But the man would say to them,
nah. Time's running short.
And the man would tell Brian that he had just broken out of prison in Montana and killed a guard on the way out. And I don't know if this was like some weird way of him to scare them, just to let them know that there was no chance of getting away, or to gain some sort of psychological upper hand, or for the fact that he could cover himself if one of them didn't die. I'm not sure, but it was a very strange thing to say, especially if that wasn't the case. And the man's appearance had a clear indication that he had a hunger for violence, as he wore an executioner's hood that covered his head, shoulders, and the front of his chest. The hood bore the circle cross symbol we now associate as the symbol of the Zodiac killer. So the Zodiac killer would hold them at gunpoint and eventually tie them up with plastic clothesline. He would make Cecilia tie up Brian, and Brian, being extremely smart, would make the knots seem like they were tighter than they were when Cecilia actually tied them pretty loose. And the Zodiac killer would tie up Cecilia himself with knots that were horrifically tight. And Brian would whisper to Cecilia that he thought he could get a hold of the Zodiac killer's gun. But she would respond in complete and utter fear, which absolutely, like being in that situation, a lot of people, I assume, would just want to be agreeable with the killer, so she was scared that if he did that, they would both get killed, so he decided to go back on that plan. And then, without any warning at all, the Zodiac killer would begin his brutal attack, stabbing Brian 6 times in the back, one of which would go through his lung, and Cecilia would get stabbed 10 times, both in the front and in the back, using a knife with a blade nearly a foot long. And as the Zodiac killer would walk away, he would leave a very disturbing message on the car of Brian's white Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. And it would bear the dates of his previous attack with the same circle cross signature, which in my opinion is very obvious that he just wants to take credit for those attacks and make sure that the police know that this is done by the same killer. So he just wants credit where credit's due, basically, in a really up way. And like I said before, the couple were in a very remote area at a kind of a weird time, so they didn't see any other people there besides the Zodiac killer, so the odds of somebody coming by to find them were very, very slim. But thankfully, a fisherman would hear them screaming and would alert the park rangers. And by the time help had arrived, the two had freed themselves, but both victims would be in critical condition, obviously being stabbed so many times. And the ambulance wouldn't arrive until an hour later after being found. So Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell would be taken to the hospital immediately, but unfortunately Cecilia would succumb to her injuries and pass away in less than 48 hours after the attack. Although Brian would survive, which is how we know about all of the details of the attack and what the Zodiac's appearance was, and the fact that the knife looked homemade almost, according to the police report. And while in the hospital, Brian would be interviewed, giving us the insight into the mind of someone who believed themselves to be dying.
At the beginning, I did think I was going to die. And so from that moment on, one has to have certain goals that you have to set. The first goal, of course, was to live. I suppose the second goal was to get untied. The next one was to get help. From getting help, getting to the hospital. You know, you have to have a successive set of goals. And if you can keep this going and you can keep your mind active, whether you die or not, you're at least psychologically attuned, whether you're in shock or not. If you can keep arguing with yourself, praying, doing anything to keep your mind off of yourself, or at least just not lapsing back and just saying, well, it's no use.
And you could just tell in that interview that he's just such a well-spoken, smart man, and it's so sad what happened to him and his friend Cecilia, and my heart goes out to the families and victims, obviously, and to the Zodiac killer, but we'll get back to it. And at 7:40 p.m., just over an hour after the attack, the Napa County Police Department would receive a chilling call. In a calm, emotionless voice, the caller reported,
I wanted to report a murder. No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Karmann Ghia.
And before hanging up, the caller would claim,
I'm the one who did it.
And this call, paired with the writing on the doors of the car, would confirm that this was a genuine Zodiac killer attack. And the police would trace that phone call to a phone booth in Napa downtown, where they would find fingerprints that they hope would lead to the Zodiac killer, but unfortunately it did not. And Cecilia's death would be extremely widely mourned, and her funeral would draw a crowd of those grieving the losses of other victims of the Zodiac killer. Her funeral procession was over 50 cars long. And because Brian survived, and even though the Zodiac killer was hooded at the time, Brian was able to give a description based upon what he could see. He would describe the killer as a white male between 5'8" and 6 foot, with dark brown hair and a heavy-set build. And other clues were found, but they offered no clear path to his identity. But the police would find a size 10.5 wing walker shoe print and tire tracks at the scene, suggesting a methodical, cold-blooded predator who enjoyed taunting his pursuers. And though these 3 attacks show a calculating mind, and the use of a costume obviously indicates some amount of forethought being put into these attacks, Brian Hartnell, who was in his hospital bed, didn't believe that this man was fully aware of what he was doing. And this attack would add another layer to the Zodiac's terrifying persona. No longer content with just simple murder, he now introduced bizarre elements to his crimes, leaving both the investigators and the public in a state of shock and confusion. And one thing that's interesting is the close proximity in time between the second attack and the third attack. The murders of both the couples before the third attack had been in relative close proximity to each other, near Vallejo and Berryessa, but this time it was different. This third attack would transpire quite a ways north in Napa Valley on Lake Berryessa. And could this large distance have contributed to the Zodiac killer not waiting as long before attacking again, potentially thinking himself safe to attack sooner in an area people may be less vigilant? Maybe. Was his hunger for killing getting stronger as he kept getting away with it? Possibly. It would seem this would become a pattern, as exactly 2 weeks later, the Zodiac killer would attack again, in the heart of San Francisco. Which brings us to attack number 4. Paul Stein was a part-time insurance agent and a student at San Francisco State College, who was working on the night of October 11th, 1969. And he was working a late night shift as a taxi driver, which he did to pay his way through college. And this night, his final fare would be hailed at the theater in between the intersection where Geary Street meets Mason and where Geary meets Powell. And the destination for this fare was Presidio Heights, an affluent neighborhood known for its tranquil streets and upscale homes, though the tranquility of this night would be short-lived. The corner of Washington and Maple Street were intended for this person's drop-off, but the journey would end a block away at Washington and Cherry Streets. The trip would end at roughly 9:55 p.m. when Paul was shot in the head at point-blank range. The firearm that was used was a 9mm semi-automatic, which was not the same gun used at the attack in Blue Rock Springs Park. And this gunshot would be extremely loud, so a gunshot in this affluent community would probably not go unnoticed. So across the street, 3 young individuals would witness this attack from about 60 feet away and watch the following actions of the Zodiac killer. They would watch the Zodiac killer go through Stein's belongings in the front seat and then would wipe down the cab with what appeared to be a cloth, like wiping away fingerprints, maybe, possibly, probably, most likely, I think. So the police would obviously be quickly called, and the Zodiac killer would not be masked at this point either. They were able to see very clearly the man who eluded capture for so long. They would describe a white man between the ages of 25 and 30 with a stocky build and reddish-brown hair that was worn in a crew cut. He would wear heavy rimmed glasses, not unlike the ones I'm wearing right now. No, I am not the Zodiac killer. I wasn't born yet. And dark clothing, also not unlike what I'm wearing right now. I promise I'm not the Zodiac killer. And this is the description of the Zodiac killer that would be eventually sketched. Why do I kind of look like it? It's not me. It's not me, I swear. And the witnesses would last see the Zodiac killer heading north on Cherry Street, but unfortunately dispatch miscommunicated the description given by the witnesses and told responding officers that the suspect was a black male. How the f do you f that up? Rather than a white male, obviously, perhaps confusing it with the dark clothing. And responding officers Donald Folk and Eric Zelms passed a man who very well could have been the Zodiac killer on Jackson Street. But due to the inaccuracy of the information that was provided to them, they obviously never stopped him. They would only realize their mistake later when the correct description was given to them that they probably missed him by that much, and there was no trace as to where he could have gone after that. And the man that the officers saw appeared to be older than what the original witnesses described him as, being 25 to 30. They thought he was perhaps 35 to 45, so an updated sketch was drawn. And these subtle differences were shown side by side with the original drawing, not differing too much. And these are the closest images we have to the Zodiac killer in the last 50 plus years. And when the crime scene was secured by police officers, they would find bloody fingerprints on the scene, perhaps missed by the Zodiac killer when wiping it down in haste, and Stein would unfortunately be found deceased, slumped over the passenger side of the vehicle, with an arm dangling out the passenger door. And initially it wasn't known that this was an actual Zodiac killer attack, and instead it was believed that this was probably just a taxi robbery gone wrong, because Stein's wallet and keys were missing when the body was found. And also what was missing would be a large section of Stein's shirt. Perhaps the part of his shirt was taken as a rag to wipe down the fingerprints, but alas, it was missing. But not for long. It would be found 2 days later, on October 13th, 1969. The San Francisco Chronicle would receive a letter from the Zodiac killer claiming responsibility for the murder of Stein, with the missing portion of his shirt included. The letter taunted the police, saying that they could have caught the Zodiac killer had they searched the park, which is such a slap in the face. Like, you, dude. The letter said that they were more focused on who could make more noise rather than catching a killer, so basically just mocking them. He also threatened to kill a full school bus, saying he would shoot the front tire and quote unquote pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. Sick bastard. But despite the description, the fingerprints, and the letters, there has still never been a confirmed identity of the Zodiac killer. And as forensic technology has continued to advance, there has been continued efforts to identify him, obviously. Though most of the modern attempts to solve this mystery are spearheaded by internet sleuths and people fixated on the case. Ever since the San Francisco Police Department decided to close the case back in 2004. Which brings us to the topic of today, which is my grandfather is the Zodiac killer. Not me, it's just the name of the video that the TikTok guy came out with. So now that we have all of the Zodiac killer information, let's get into the TikTok videos and claims. So obviously, over the years, quite a few people have been theorized to be the Zodiac killer, whether you choose to believe these speculations or not. But I find only a couple of them are really compelling. And I think it's important to analyze these compelling suspects and links between them and the Zodiac killer. So we'll be looking at these suspects specifically before analyzing the recent development in which the Zodiac has seemingly been identified again, this time by his own grandson. So stay tuned. First of the suspects is Arthur Lee Allen. Now, Arthur Lee Allen is one of the most prominent suspects in the Zodiac killer case to date. His potential connection to the Zodiac began with the murder of Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside, California on October 30th, 1966. Allen was reportedly in Riverside that weekend, and police would later discover a, wait for it, royal typewriter, similar to the ones used for the anonymous confession letters, in Allen's home. Triple whammy. Triple whammy. And the letters regarding Bates contained symbols and signs that some experts say are linked to the Zodiac, although definitive connections were never actually made. So it is all speculation and conspiracy, essentially. Allen had a very troubling history, though, that intersected eerily with the Zodiac's timeline. He was fired as a teacher for essaying multiple students and then moved back to his parents' home, just minutes from the site of the first Zodiac killings on Lake Herman Road in December of 1968. And this is interesting as well. Allen's brother gifted him a Zodiac watch in 1967, which bore the same circle cross symbol that the Zodiac killer used in his letters. And in the late 1960s, Allen allegedly told his friend Don Cheney about his desire to kill couples, taunt police with letters, and, conveniently enough, use the name Zodiac, which Cheney eventually reported to police. And these discussions involved using a flashlight to shoot at night, wearing disguises, and even writing a novel about these fantasies. Allen would be questioned by police multiple times, obviously, and became a primary suspect in the Zodiac case. And in 1971, he would be formally interviewed by the Vallejo Police Department and subjected to several search warrants over the years. And Allen would also appear in interviews where reporters would literally ask him point blank if he was the Zodiac killer, which he would always deny.
Are you the Zodiac killer?
No, definitely not. No. I couldn't murder anyone.
And the physical evidence found during the searches of Allen's property would include a typewriter similar to the one that the Zodiac used to write those letters, bomb diagrams, and letters threatening school children, which, if we go back, we saw that letter about the kids in the school bus and how he would take all of them out as they came bouncing out of the school bus. I don't even want to remember it, to be honest. Allen would also have a shoe size of 10 and a half, which we saw in evidence earlier as well. There would also be matching prints found at the Lake Berryessa crime scene, and would own a knife similar to the one used in that attack as well. And there are also further connections made between Arthur and the Zodiac killer that led people to believe he was responsible as well. If you were to rearrange the symbols at the bottom of the letter the Zodiac wrote about the film The Exorcist, it spells Lee, Arthur's middle name, also mine, which I don't like. Spelled differently though, so it's fine. I think that's kind of a stretch, but I digress. And in the letters written about Cherry Bates, there was a strange looking character at the bottom of the page, appearing like a Z, or Z for you Americans. But some say it's a 32, because there's kind of like a 3 on top and it goes into a 2. And the supposed link to Arthur Allen with the 32 is that he was 32 at the time that Cherry was killed, and lived at 32 Fresno Street in Vallejo, California. And the Zodiac cipher, wait for it, would also have 32 characters. But despite these circumstantial links, there was no concrete evidence to tie Allen directly to the Zodiac crimes. Handwriting and DNA test would fail to conclusively match him to the Zodiac letters. And after he died in 1992, Allen's house would be searched again. And authorities would find intriguing items, but they would find no confession or definitive proof of guilt. Which, like, I don't know, you look at the handwriting and stuff, and it's like, he could have changed it. Why wouldn't he change it up a little bit? I can change my writing up pretty easily, man. Like, what kind of police work is that? I know it is, but still, it just, I don't know. There's a lot of connections there. I know it's kind of like off with him, like, doing those things to children and then randomly, like, killing adults, and maybe his friend just wanted to be famous for knowing the Zodiac killer and saying that he confessed to them and stuff. I'm not sure. There's a lot of weird coincidences, like circumstantial evidence. I'm not sure, but we'll get into the rest. So ultimately, while many elements of Allen's life and actions aligned with the Zodiac's crimes, the evidence remained inconclusive. And looking at the police reports when Arthur Lee Allen was arrested for his crimes against children, it's clear he was a monster. He would lure children into the bedroom of his trailer before performing SA acts on them, reportedly saying things like, "I know you don't like it, but I'm just a nasty man. I hope to God you're rotting in hell, you filthy, disgusting, nasty piece of shit." So obviously Arthur was a monster, but was he the monster? We don't know, but that brings us to our next suspect, Richard Gaikowski. Gaikowski would serve in the army as a medic, learning skills that might have been utilized in the Zodiac's crimes, such as using torn clothes for bandages, homemade weapons, etc. This detail is one that links Gaikowski to the Zodiac tearing a piece of Paul Stein's shirt during that one attack. Though in that instance, the shirt wasn't necessarily used as a bandage. Instead, it was used to claim that murder later on. So Gaikowski would be arrested and would spend 38 hours in jail back in October of 1965 for refusing to sign a traffic citation. And he would do this while working at the Morning News Gazette, which was a local newspaper. Interesting. To write a story about the conditions of county jail from an inmate's perspective. And the circumstantial evidence is that during the time of this arrest, he lived 5 miles from the site of the first attack. So by 1969, Richard would be working for a different newspaper, The Good Times, Not So Good Times, which was basically an anti-establishment, anti-police, and often a pro-violence publication that had published diagrams to build bombs. Good times. And in January of 1969, he would publish a fictional story about a revolutionary group called the Berkeley Revolutionary Committee for Business, which engages and humiliates the combined police forces of the Bay Area of July 4th, 1969, the same date that the Zodiac's second attack would transpire. And the story also talks about police frantically searching suburban areas for bombs and booby traps. Good times is also found in the Zodiac's letters, though not used as a proper noun indicating a name, and more so referring to the Good Times. And further circumstantial evidence shows that the address for the Good Times switchboard was only a couple doors away from Paul Stein's address. Also, an article from the Good Times about donating books to the switchboard's address next to Stein's home is a shortened version of Richard Gaikowski's name to 4 letters, Gaik. And this is linked by some to a cipher by the Zodiac, which, when solved, is a letter about how the Zodiac will not reveal his name, with a similar sounding 4 letters, Gaik. And perhaps a more compelling piece of evidence would be that Nancy Slover, a police dispatcher who actually spoke with the Zodiac killer when he called to reclaim the responsibility on July 4th, has identified the Zodiac's voice as Richard's.
Hi everybody, it's Nancy again. I'm back. I listened to the voice of Richard. I felt shocked and deja vu. In my opinion, he was the same person who I listened to in July of 1969, or twin.
And we, of course, don't actually have a recording of the call that Nancy had with the Zodiac killer, but there is a recording of Gaikowski talking about code breaking in relation to the Zodiac's messages.
The whole thing about a code, you got to remember also, once a telecode is broken, you have never any way of knowing whether it's a real code or whether it's just a fake code.
So what's that mean?
So it just means that sometimes, you know, like the military and all of that, sometimes you would send garbled messages that meant absolutely nothing, so that you get the enemy to spend all their time trying to break the code.
And you can compare that to when someone claiming being the Zodiac called into a live TV broadcast, talking about having headaches ever since he killed a kid and continued to kill children.
Just tell us what's going on inside you right now, Sam, please.
I have headache.
All right. How long have you had those headaches, Sam? In a long time?
Since I killed a kid.
If it all boils down to the question of you're giving yourself up, if you could be assured that you wouldn't get capital punishment for myself.
I don't want to give myself up.
Huh?
I want to kill those kids.
Oh, what's that mean?
I want to kill those kids.
Oh, what's that mean?
I want to kill those kids.
And the voices don't really sound the same, meaning potentially one of the following is true. Richard isn't the Zodiac. The person that called the TV broadcast isn't the Zodiac. Or neither of them are the Zodiac. Just a lot of unanswered questions and frustration. And creepy f***ing dudes. And whether or not you find enough evidence to pin Gaikowski to the Zodiac killings, investigators would never find enough to suspect him, So those are basically just two more interesting examples of people who are suspected to be the Zodiac killer, though the claims would never be verified and have not been verified. But there are, of course, other people who have had their name associated with the Zodiac, with some even being alleged in the past few years. Gary Francis Post, for example. Gary Francis Post was identified as a potential candidate for the Zodiac back in 2021, when Casebreakers, a group of former cops, forensic analysts, and private investigators specializing in cold cases came together. They claimed that the DNA obtained from a hiking mat belonged to Post, bore strong similarities to the DNA recovered at the Zodiac crime scenes, as well as sharing a resemblance to the sketch drawings of the Zodiac. They also alleged that he had secretly been a suspect since 2016. And Thomas J. Colbert, the founder of Casebreakers, which I love, they're like the Avengers of cops, would be in an interview with Fox News.
My FBI guys say it's irrefutable. It's a match.
Though the FBI contact was never named, and the FBI has never confirmed Post as an actual suspect, despite the claims that he secretly was. In fact, the FBI has even countered this claim by saying it's actually still open, and there's no new information. So much for the Avengers. There are also claims that Gary Francis Post trained a posse of killers to whom he claimed was the Zodiac. And this accusation that Gary is the Zodiac is even believed by Gary's former neighbor, who had been babysat by Gary and his wife. And this claim that Gary could potentially be the Zodiac killer essentially boils down to the fact that he had a scar on his head, and that the Zodiac killer potentially had a scar on his head as well. And they also shared the same shoe size.
I looked up to Gary's Post as an uncle. I used to cut his hair. I spent nights at his house.
For others like Gwen, who grew up with Gary and his wife Mary babysitting her, after a revelation from a 2018 conversation, there's no question in her mind. Post is the man some suspect him to be.
Post would also live near the area of murders and own firearms as well. But in America, near San Francisco, I think if those are the criterias for guilt, there might be over 1,000 Zodiacs out there, probably more, probably tens of thousands of Zodiac killers out there. And on YouTube, there are videos attempting to debunk the idea that Post was the Zodiac at all. And one of them is a guy named David Gold saying that Gary couldn't have been the Zodiac because he knew guys who were the Zodiac.
You guys know that I'm telling you Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were the Zodiac killers, because I knew them.
All right. Strangely, it does seem that a lot of people claim to have known the Zodiac killer, and one such person took to TikTok to share that they were even related to the Zodiac killer. Potentially. Let's get into it. But first, we'll start at my story. Caleb and I were just scrolling through our FYP on TikTok in the morning, as we do most mornings or nights, and this man comes across the TikTok, and his name is Jay Foy. And me, having not thought about the Zodiac since the movie had come out years and years previous, great movie, you should check it out, this man started to explain how he believes his own grandfather was the Zodiac killer. And that just tickled my fancy. It made the hairs on my neck stand up and my pores open up and my butthole Needless to say, I was interested immediately.
My grandpa is the motherfucking Zodiac killer. I want to start off by saying this is not just based off physical appearance. I typed in my grandpa's name on Google the other day, and to my surprise, internet sleuths have been throwing my grandpa's name around for years, connecting him as the Zodiac motherfucking killer. As you can see here in all these pictures on the screen somewhere, that it looks exactly like my grandpa. My grandpa was a Vallejo police officer. Yes, the same area where the Zodiac killer's killings took place. Darlene Farron and her boyfriend Mike or Matt, forgot the guy's name, were driving around Vallejo one night, the night that my grandfather happened to be on duty, driving an unmarked police car and wearing plain clothes.
First of all, I just want to say that his TikToks and his cadence in his TikToks sounded like he was laying down the dopest rap song I ever heard in my life. He like hit beats. He hit beats. I was just listening like this. Yeah, dude, what the I was into it. But basically, he states that internet sleuths were throwing around his grandpa's name, stating that he could be a potential serial killer. Since like 2016, people have been talking about his grandpa's name, which is Richard Hoffman. And there are quite literally forums about Richard Hoffman being the Zodiac killer, which is very interesting. I know you watched some of the TikTok that I just put up, but he is kind of all over the place, so we jump cut a lot and tried to get to the point, but I think he was just fueled with pure passion and amazement from his findings, so I don't blame him. So this might be a little bit confusing, but bear with me, all right? Bear with me. Stay with me. Stay with me. Breathe. So he would show some pictures of his grandfather next to the Zodiac killer, and he would bring up how Richard Hoffman, his grandfather, was a police officer at the Vallejo Police Department as well, the same area where the murders were happening. And in the Darlene Farron and Michael McGow story from Blue Rock Springs Park, he talks about when they were driving around, a car was supposedly following them the whole time, almost patrolling them, something that police officers do. Ooh. I don't know. And this was the same night that his grandfather was supposedly on duty as well, doing his own patrol in an unmarked car and wearing civilian clothes. And after being followed around, they pulled over into the Blue Rock Springs parking lot, where the killer's car would pull alongside them. And the killer would supposedly get out, and Darlene would supposedly say, "Oh my God, that's Richard. He's going to kill us both." And this was all because she was dating a police officer behind her husband's back, calling Darlene a thotty in the TikTok.
Mike, who ended up surviving the shooting, said that they were being followed around by this car all night in Vallejo before they pulled into Blue Rock Springs. They said when they parked, the car pulled in, a man hopped out of the car, and Darlene, the girl who passed away, said, "Oh my God, that's Richard. He's gonna kill us both." Apparently, she was dating a police officer in Vallejo behind her husband's back. She was apparently a thotty. So this guy in her passenger seat is one of her many boyfriends, and it was well known by her friend group that she was dating a Vallejo cop, although she never told them the name.
And he brings up that this Vallejo cop was known in his friend's circle, and during a party he would show up uninvited, and she was absolutely terrified of him.
She had a painting party at her house a few weeks before her murder, and it was said that my grandfather Richard Hoffman showed up uninvited, and she told her circle of friends that she is scared to death of him, and he was not invited there.
But Richard claimed to have never seen this woman before, yet she worked at a local restaurant, and he's confused on how his grandpa could have known that if he had never seen the woman before, which is fair.
My grandpa denies these claims. He says he never laid eyes on her, but then later goes on to say, "I know that she worked at a restaurant locally here in Vallejo." How the f*** have you never laid eyes on her, Grandpa? You tell me about that. As Mike said, right before they got shot, she said, "That's Richard, he's gonna kill us both." My grandpa's name is Richard Hoffman.
And he moves to his next claim of his grandfather's writing, pointing out how his grandfather misspells until as until with 2 L's instead of 1. That's how you spell until, in case you didn't know. And the Zodiac also misspelled until with 2 L's on 2 different occasions.
In a letter that the Zodiac wrote, and my grandpa's police reports, and also this poem that I'm going to talk about later, my grandpa spells the word until wrong. He spells it wrong. He puts 2 L's at the end. Where in multiple letters of the Zodiac wrote, he also spells until with 2 L's at the mother end.
And jumping around again, he brings up Sherry Bates' case, a murder that happened before Darlene Farron's murder. This guy's clearly not a YouTuber. He doesn't talk in chronological order, but it's all right. I'm here. I'm here, baby girl. I'm here.
Well, let's talk about the Sherry Bates murder that took place a couple years before the Darlene Ferrin murder.
He states that she was in a library doing homework, freshly moved from Nebraska.
She was in a library doing her homework.
And why does he bring up Nebraska? Well, his grandfather was from Nebraska, and his mother was born there as well. And all of a sudden, Sherry is found dead.
She had just moved from Nebraska. Nebraska, why do I mention that? Because my grandpa lived in Nebraska. My mother, biological mother, was born in Nebraska.
And underneath the desk at Riverside City College Library, a poem was found. And forensic analysis states that the poem, due to the spelling style, is confirmed to be from the Zodiac killer. I just got chills. Oh my god. And to add another weirder layer to everything, the initials alongside the poem include RH. The initials of his grandfather are RH as well, obviously Richard Hoffman.
This murder took place. She was at the library studying one night. She leaves and gets shot up where they found a poem handwritten underneath a motherfucking desk. And forensic analysis and handwriting analysis say that is the exact writings of the Zodiac. And they say that this is possibly the first killing that the Zodiac ever did. Well, this letter was initialed RH at the very bottom. RH, Richard Hoffman.
And the poem, for those of you who want to know, is:
sick of living, unwilling to die, cut, clean, if red, clean, blood spurting, dripping, spilling all over her new dress. Oh well, it was red anyway, life draining into uncertain death. She won't die this time. Someone it find her. Just wait till next time.
That is a terrible poem. I wouldn't even snap for you in slam poetry, you sick bitch. So doing some digging, according to the case, the poem was found by a custodian 6 months after the murder on October 30th, 1966. A month after the murder, 2 identical type letters were received at the RPD headquarters and editorial offices at Riverside Press Enterprise. And these letters describe in detail the details of the murder, stating that they disabled Sherry's car, offered her assistance, and then lured her into an alley to murder her. And then the letter also describes that they only had one thing on their mind: making her pay for the brush-offs that she had given me during the years prior. What a petty asshole. This is linked because the authors of these letters almost bragged to the editorial offices about the murder, which the Zodiac did frequently in his letters. However, it could just be a jealous love interest who's dead set on revenge, because most serial killers do brag about their killings. But anyway, the link between them stated that they were insanely similar to the Zodiac. And on March 13th, 1971, the Zodiac killer would claim to the Los Angeles Times that he was indeed responsible for the murder of Bates, stating,
I do have to give credit for stumbling across my Riverside activity, but they are only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there.
And he's absolutely blown away that no one is linking his grandfather to the murders, since those initials are literally the same. And he would share a photo of his sister and his grandfather as well. And he would continue to give some more background on his grandfather.
Let's talk about his character. My grandpa's character, he was known in my family to be controlling, manipulating, and also unfaithful to my grandmother.
Just a right piece of shite. A right piece of shite. With so much evidence also pointing back to him, yet people don't believe it. However, he states he can't really do much about it because his grandfather has passed away. Aww. Sounded like such a great guy. And people were, rightfully unconvinced, because, it's a guy on TikTok saying that he claims that his grandfather is a Zodiac killer. Everybody wants attention on TikTok. Those TikTokers, am I right? Crazy. But he would give us even more evidence and even show a clip from a documentary with his grandfather speaking. And for some reason, it's really weird, but him talking about her bra fluttering, almost like a poem, was so weird and creepy.
During the ride to the hospital. And of course her shirt or sweater, whatever she was wearing, was off. And each time that ambulance attendant blew air into her chest, there was a little piece of material from her bra that I could see fluttered with every breath he blew into that girl.
Ugh! What the f***? And he would also show a clip from the same documentary where the name Richard is brought up, from the man who was with Darlene, Michael McGow.
Friend of hers, not to worry about it. He was just jealous. That's all she said about him. He was just jealous. She never mentioned his name, but she said something about Richard. I was talking about his name was Richard. I kept his name Richard. And I think that was his name. She referred to him as Richard, the Zodiac killer, the guy. Did you say he's really a mean temper and that if he ever found out he...
So he states that Richard was brought up and that he had a mean temper, and if he found out that they were together, he'd kill them. He did. He tried. He did. He killed one of them. So this is looking interesting. It looks interesting. But he does clarify from some of the hate comments that he isn't bragging about the murders or the situation. He does seem pretty genuine in watching it. He was just informing everyone because it is really interesting. He's literally pretty much the most infamous serial killer of all time. So like, it is extremely interesting information, especially if it's somebody in your family. I know I would say the same, not like wanting to claim that because I would be kind of embarrassed to have the same blood as that. I think anybody would, really. That's why people change their names that are related to serial killers, you know? So it seems kind of weird that people are hating on him for that because there seems to be actual tangible albeit circumstantial evidence, but I digress. And he says also that he didn't even have a relationship with his grandfather.
So first, I'm not excited, I'm not happy, I'm not thrilled, I'm not proud. A lot of people in the comments are thinking that I'm proud. I am shocked, my jaw's on the floor, and I'm simply sharing information with you guys on the internet.
Because he was and he hated his mother.
Me and my grandpa did not have a relationship after the age of 9. I spent damn near every Christmas there at his house up until I was 9 when my father got custody of me. He would have my mother, he would my grandmother and his children, my uncles as well. And I learned that later growing up in life. He hated my mother. He did not like my mother.
And going back to the statement about him talking about the broth lettering and Jay Foy talking about how his grandfather liked to talk in poems and so did the Zodiac killer, he feels that they both align in the same writing style, which is fair. Not a lot of people talk in poetic terms, I don't think, unless you're living in like the 1800s or some shit, I don't know. And he adds to this too, the spelling errors that his grandfather makes is also the spelling errors that the Zodiac killer makes. And according to research, the first 2 Zodiac letters contained multiple funny spelled words. So you can see the Zodiac killer's funny spelled words and Richard Hoffman's funny spelled words as well. And this detail is constantly brought up by Jay Foy. He stated that his grandfather hated spelling and crossword puzzles, but loved math. And he was also a woodworker. And he states that his grandfather worked in the juvenile division, wearing plain clothes and unmarked cars on the night of Darlene Ferrin's shooting. So could this link to the description given, since the assailant from Michael's story was in plain clothes in a normal car? Maybe, but his division, the juvenile one that he was talking about, was basically meant to stop kids from fighting or hanging out too late, basically like soliciting. And there was no activity about a half hour beforehand when he was patrolling. So it's very, very suspicious that he didn't see anyone there, you know? It's weird. So he found these kids at a park that were soliciting, basically. He was in that division, so it was like part of his job. I don't know. It's kind of weird. It's all weird, dude. I don't know, dude. And now we are in part 4 of his stories, bringing up one of the Zodiac's poems.
So I found this poem written by the Zodiac, and in this poem, it uses the phrase, titwillow, titwillow, titwillow. Well, titwillow happens to be a song written by Mikado.
It states, titwillow, titwillow, titwillow 3 times. This is the title of the song written by Mikado.
And in that song lyrics, there happens to be a mention of Dickie Bird right here. Also in this poem by Mikado, the Titwillow, that's the title of it. It states when describing a man who's passing away that he gargled out blood.
So where does this tie in exactly? Well, Joe Foy states that his grandfather gave a description of the scene saying he was gurgling in pain. Interesting.
There was a young guy down there laying on his back. Obviously had been shot. He was reaching up towards me or the flashlight I was holding, kind of gurgling, obviously in pain.
And maybe he's combining the Zodiac's love for poems to the Richard using a description of a victim gurgling as a reference. I don't know. And he does state that that may be a reach, and I think it is kind of a reach, but he does give more evidence. The Dickie Bird portion stating that a code word left at the bottom of a Zodiac killer's signature. It happens to spell the word, which is another name for someone named Richard, you got it. And it's funny because in the section before it states that it could be spelled Lee, the other suspect that we were talking about before, Arthur. So it really just could mean nothing. Like when I was looking at this, you could rearrange it in literally any way, so I feel like this is a bit of a stretch. But if we actually read the full letter of the Zodiac here, we learn he was referencing the Mikado poem. In Act 2 of the Mikado poem, it reads, "Now I feel just as sure as I'm sure that my name isn't Willow to Twillow, that 'twas blighted affection that made him explain, oh Willow to Twillow, and if you remain callous and obdurate, I shall perish as he did, and you will know why, though I probably shall not exclaim as I die, oh Willow to Twillow. I don't know what it means, dude. I don't know. And these reference the portion signed yours truly, with the blank name then referencing this poem. Pretty much it's just a very long-winded explanation for the fact that he wanted to reference the Mikado poem, which states his name isn't Willow, and that Joe Foy sees the code could be signed as Dick with Dickie Bird, referenced in the Mikado poem. But it literally could mean nothing. Again, I think it's a bit of a stretch, but I don't know. And the rest of the TikToks do have a story kind of coming to an end because bigger projects are on the way to spread his story in a more produced type of way, which I think will be extremely interesting. So hopefully we'll have an update video. But I think it's time to kind of combine the facts and try to make it make sense. So let's do it. So Richard Hoffman was a man who worked in the Vallejo Police Department, and he was on the scene of the shooting of Darlene Ferris and Michael McGow. And he not only was on the scene in an unmarked police car, but was in civilian clothing as well. This was also his division, and he was in the area. But according to his reports, he saw nothing suspicious in the area. Also, I would just like to note as well that she saw a flashlight going into the vehicle and thought it was a police officer. So I kind of want to safely assume that maybe, I know it wasn't said, but like, it's just a weird thing for just a civilian to do. It's a very policey thing to do, so it just makes me kind of wonder, you know? It makes you kind of wonder. I don't know. Anyway, I digress. Let's continue. And to add to it, the descriptions of the Zodiac killer from the sketches looks oddly similar to Richard Hoffman. Oh, it really does. He's just old here. Oh, it's crazy. Oh, look at him when he's young. I just want to believe. Oh my God. And Richard Hoffman, in an interview, states that he never actually knew the girl. Yet, according to Michael McGow, he states hearing Darlene mention Richard, the same Richard that could have supposedly showed up uninvited to that party where she was super scared of him and feared for her life. He also knew a man that she was with was possibly a Vallejo cop, and Richard was a Vallejo cop. And a payphone only 2 blocks away from the Vallejo department was the payphone that was used by the Zodiac killer when he called in. And Richard was a cop at this exact same location. Richard Hoffman also had bad spelling, as did the Zodiac killer. Richard was also a crazed man, supposedly, according to Joe Foy, stating he was a and the family didn't like him at all. These could be aligned with how serial killers act towards their family members, distant and other similar tendencies, but then on the other side of the coin, they could seem completely normal on the outside and be completely horrific to strangers, basically. So, again, it's a stretch. And the evidence of the strange writing under the desk, labeled with the initials RH, the same initials that Richard Hoffman has, obviously, Richard Hoffman, RH, who was supposedly in this location at the exact same time. So all of these facts lead him to be a potential suspect for the Zodiac. And the fact that he could have worked as a police officer would have given him easier access to guns and to be undetected. So the descriptions match, some evidence leaves questions, and it seems to me that some of the stories brought up by Joe Foy the TikToker should not go completely unignored. Was his grandfather the Zodiac killer? It seems without more direct evidence and searching through his now dead grandfather's belongings, the suspicions may just be that. But apparently with him working on this future project, maybe investigators can bring these clues together. I'm really interested to see that. And the final answer to the long-awaited question of who the Zodiac killer was can be answered, and hopefully put to rest. But until then, that is it. That is the video. That is the deep dive on the Zodiac killer and potential Zodiac suspects, and also all the new theories collected by Joe Foy. I'm very interested to see if something comes out about this. I will absolutely keep you updated, so stay here, just stay here. This is nice. This was great. I know you're here for a long time. Did you make it to the end? If you did like the video, and also tell me it below. Spell until with 2 L's if you made it to the end of the video. But yeah, he's a piece of shit, the Zodiac Killer, and all these guys that we're talking about, basically. I hope they're all rotting in hell. And until then, I'll see your beautiful face in the next video. All right?